What about people referred to them in their questions as carb blockers, but I think what they're referring to are things like berberine and some of the glucose scavengers. And one glucose scavenger I'd love for you to comment on is this assertion that taking a brisk walk after a meal, or maybe even a slow walk after a meal, some movement can help downshift the amount of circulating glucose in some way. I've heard that. Not a lot of people, but some are starting to pay attention to this idea of taking things like berberine or even metformin can scavenge glucose. I personally can't take berberine. If I take it, I get massive headaches unless I've ingested tons of sugar and carbohydrates. So I just don't mess around with it. But I know there are a number of people out there that want to know whether or not these glucose scavengers can be useful.
I think that is really majoring in the minors, if I'm being honest. As far as like the carb blockers, there's like some white kidney bean extract and those sorts of things. They can, they do block the digestion of carbohydrates, some. So when I say block, that's those watching or listening. Metabolism is typically not on and off switches. Okay, so when we say things like block or attenuate or inhibit, typically we're not talking about just a switch on the wall that you press it and everything turns off. We're talking about a dimmer switch. Okay, like so it just changes the emphasis. But these carb blockers can reduce the absorption of carbohydrate. Now, they don't seem to cause weight loss when you just do it a normal diet. Now, why is that? Well, all it does is once those carbohydrates get to the large intestine and your bacteria get a hold of them, they start fermenting them to volatile fatty acids, which get reabsorbed into your liver. So you don't get the increase in blood glucose, but you still get almost all the calories from it because it's just in a different form.
I see.
So, if carb blockers, if they actually worked really well, I mean, if you block something from being absorbed, your GI typically does not just let undigested material sit in there. You get diarrhea. I mean, that would be the outcome. That's also how I debunk the whole 30 grams of protein at a meal. You can't absorb any more than that. I'm like, if that was the case, when you ate a steak, you would just start having diarrhea every time you went over that 30 gram threshold, right?
I remember during college, so this would be early 90s, there was the Olestra craze.
Oh, yeah.
This idea of putting a non-digestible thing into things like potato chips so that it would clear through the GI tract faster, not absorb as many calories. It does raise, this went nowhere, obviously. You don't hear about this anymore, but it does raise an interesting question related to energy balance, which is gastric emptying time. Mm-hmm. And obviously in the landscape of eating disorders, in particular anorexia, use and abuse of laxatives is a way in which people will, in an unhealthy way, try and control their weight. And there's a lot of problems with that approach. But what about gastric emptying time? Is this one way that people could control their energy balance in a healthy way? And where does fiber come into play?
Fiber tends to improve GI transit time because it adds bulk. So, your GI system is basically a tube, and it has peristalsis, which is wave-like contractions that moves the food down through the tube. Well, if you have more bulk to the food, like with fiber, you can move it through a little bit better. Now, in the gastric, the stomach specifically, fiber tends to delay gastric emptying and slow it a bit, probably because it congeals a little bit. Now, this kind of gets into the glycemic index argument, right? If you do low GI foods, you'll have a slower release of glucose. It's a slower gastric emptying time. Does that affect energy balance? And so there are quite a few studies looking at low GI versus high GI foods. In the studies where they don't control calories, low GI tends to outperform high GI, but when they control calories, there's no difference. And so what I think that suggests is low GI foods, just by their nature, tend to be higher in fiber. And so I think it just kind of comes back to the fiber issue.
Got it.